The Emperor of Mankind is probably the most pivotal individual in Warhammer 40k. An ancient psyker of unimaginable power, he waged the Unification Wars on Terra to unite the nations under his banner and began a great crusade across the stars to bring the rest of humanity into his fold. Nowadays, he sits immobile and trapped on the Golden Throne, a rotting husk of a man, bound to this realm only by his sense of duty to the humanity that he loves. No longer able to walk among them or lead armies, he now relies more than ever on his personal guard, the Adeptus Custodes. These superhumans are the Emperor's perfection made manifest. Clad in golden armor and wielding mighty guardian spears, the Custodians are the best of the best. They've protected the Emperor and acted as his voice and instruments of his will since he's been interred on the Golden Throne, and for longer still before that. But who are these exceptional warriors? What are their origins and what roles do they serve in the Imperium today? Let's get into it. Welcome back to Starhammer. Long before the Unification Wars and the forging of the Thunder Warriors that waged them, the Custodian Guard stood at the Emperor's side. These proud men and women were the Emperor's first true-born and the peak of physical and psychological augmentation. Their loyalty was unquestionable, their skill in combat rivaling that of folk heroes of old, and their weapons and armor were seen as reflections of the glory and power each of them possessed. And the Custodes aren't just physically imposing, but mentally as well. Each one possesses a tactical and strategic mind that is quite literally incomprehensible to the regular human mind, or even that of a space marine. But it isn't limited to knowledge of just warfare and of how to best protect their charges, but also of the cultures and the arts, because they weren't just created to guard the Emperor, but to be his companions as well. Someone he could have at his side who could see things in the supernatural, complex ways that he did and advise him accordingly. And while the process of creating an Astartes is well understood, the augmentation process for Custodians isn't nearly as well known outside of the Imperial household. Custodians, unlike Space Marine candidates, are practically born into the role. Their augmentation process must occur very early in infancy, and they're changed at the molecular level to the degree that males or females can undergo it, unlike Space Marine candidates who can only be males in their late teens for their augmentations to be successful. But the Custodian and the Space Marine are two very different entities. The crude augmentations the Space Marine undergoes pale in comparison to the fine-tuned, arcane biomancy that a Custodian candidate goes through. At the end of it all, the Custodian is an immortal demigod who's the shining example of the Emperor's perfection. Highly resistant to psychic influence, null effects, and unable to produce any psykers of their own, the Custodians stand as the pinnacle of the Emperor's perfect understanding of genetic manipulation and his general wisdom. But while many tried to climb the mountain, most of them failed. Because their creation is so specialized, there have only ever been about 10,000 Custodians at any given time. The earliest documentation regarding the Custodians was at the Black Manse of Nassau, where records describe the Lord of Lightning and his 4 giants of crimson and gold, demanding the surrender of the techno-barbarian stronghold. This stronghold was one of the first to submit and swear fealty to the man who would one day become the Emperor of Mankind. And it was just a few decades later, when the Custodians purged the insane Thunder Warriors, who had outlived their usefulness, that their more well-known endeavors and histories began to take shape. Now, unlike the Astartes, the Custodians were never meant to prosecute a wide-scale war. While their organization is well-equipped, they're not equipped to serve in conflicts at the scale that the Astartes are part of. Instead, they're expected to act more as like precision lasers that dominate a particular goal or section of the battle. And while their own fleet and stockpile of arms and armor might be small, the Custodians can commandeer and command any asset or personnel the Imperium can muster to accomplish their mission. If a Custodian tells you to do something, you are literally being compelled by the voice of the Emperor himself. Of course, their base of operations is the Imperial Palace on Terra, located on and below the Himalayan mountains. Most of the Custodians are here, but a sizable number traveled with the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Sometimes, they merely served as protectors. Other times, they acted as precision instruments of his wrath, with single Custodians defeating legions of alien hordes by themselves throughout the war. After the Eleanor Crusade, the Emperor withdrew to Terra to work on his Webway project, and he took the Custodians with him. This total absence only helped fuel the fires of betrayal and animosity among the Primarchs and their legions, snowballing into events that would later lead to the entire galaxy being plunged into civil war. During the Horus Heresy, the Custodians largely remained on Terra with the Emperor, but a few exceptions were made, such as at the burning of Prospero. There, Primarch Leman Russ and his legion, the Space Wolves, and a contingent of Custodians fought a battle of attrition against the alleged traitor Primarch Magnus the Red and his legion of sorcerers, the Thousand Sons. As far as they were concerned, Magnus had defied the Emperor's decree forbidding the use of sorcery, and when the Primarch used his psychic might to smash through the palace's psychic barriers, he was doing so with malicious intent. At the behest of the Emperor, they tagged along not just as a force multiplier, but as a sign to Magnus and his legion that the retribution they were about to face was at the direct hand of the Emperor and not Leman Russ. When Russ got false orders from Horus to destroy Magnus and his legion instead of bringing them in, this had the same weight as words from the Emperor himself. Horus was War Master. In all manners of war the Imperium could wage, his word would be final and an extension of the Emperor's will. So, when the Legio Custodes touched down on Prospero, they didn't go into it with the mindset of enacting discipline. They went into it with the mentality of enacting wrathful retribution against a delinquent legion and their traitorous leader. The Custodians may have had their doubts about the dubiousness of Magnus's intentions, but loyalty to the Emperor was paramount in all instances. For a Custodian, there isn't any room for pause or personal bias. They are the talons of the Emperor and will pursue his mission with total, unquestionable devotion, giving credence to their psycho-indoctrination of their creation. As Horus and his dark legions threw themselves against the Imperial Palace in the waning hours of the Civil War, the Custodians were doing what they do best, protecting the Emperor and his realm. When one Custodian would fall, he would take hundreds of traitors with him. When the Emperor faced Horus, the Custodians went with him, but they couldn't protect him from sustaining the grievous wounds he would suffer from Horus, leading to the Master being placed on the Golden Throne. While the Emperor's mind was still very much alive, his physical body really wasn't, and the Custodians were left to guard little more than a corpse. This turn of events devastated the men and women of the Legio Custodes. For all their prowess and cunning, they could not prevent Horus from mortally wounding their charge. This was a first for them, and for a very long time, the Custodians turned in their red cloaks for black ones to symbolize an era of repentance and sorrow for the faithful Royal Guard. Ultramarines Primarch Robuta Guilliman took over in the Emperor's absence as Imperial Regent and Lord Commander of the Imperial Military. Through his reorganization efforts, drastic steps were taken to ensure that something like the Horus Heresy could never happen again. The Astartes were broken up into smaller, independent chapters. The Inquisition went about covertly crushing rebellious sentiment before it blossomed, and the Legio Custodes were integrated into the various Imperial Adepta, becoming the Adeptus Custodes that we know today. After the Heresy, the Custodians stood as sentinels in the Imperial Palace, never leaving its confines of the Emperor's side. They foiled countless coups and plots in the shadows of the political behemoth that was the Royal Palace, and despite their long watch, the Custodes were as deadly and as cunning as they had ever been, never ones to sit idly by. But with the threat of chaos growing and Guilliman returning to his post to launch the Indominus Crusade, the Custodians have thrown off their black cloaks of mourning and have joined the Primarch in his quest to drive chaos back into the hellscape from whence it came, to avenge their master and absolve their sins. Though still small in number compared to the Imperial Guard or the Astartes, the Custodians bring the wrath of the Emperor himself to a galaxy on the brink of total destruction. Though a few remain to guard the Emperor, known as the Companions, a significant number of these golden armored lions have taken to the stars to wage war in the Emperor's name, crushing rebellions and banishing entire demon hosts back into the warp before they even have a chance to get off the ground. The glistening golden hulls of their void ships shine through the inky blackness of space as both a beacon of hope and as harbingers of destruction for any who dare threaten the Emperor's realm. But their inclusion on the front lines hasn't been without any issues. The Custodians and the Astartes have an animosity towards one another, as the Custodes blame the prideful Astartes for the current state of the Emperor and the Imperium. Yet, the Space Marines understand that these towering soldiers of divine wrath speak and strike with the full authority of the Emperor, and they're going to adhere to that authority regardless of personal feelings. So, now that we know a little bit about the history, how are the Custodians organized? What's so special about their equipment and armor and all that fun stuff? Let's start with where these guys sit on the Imperial hierarchy. The Custodes are the only Imperial force with the status of Magisterium Lex Ultima. Essentially, they're above any and all laws and only subservient to the Emperor himself. And being part of the Custodes automatically awards you with an Imperial lordship. Besides being charged with the protection of the Emperor and those he designates them to protect, the Custodians are also the Emperor's executioners, have been since the Unification Wars. It was during these wars that blades known as Misericordia, or a blade of mercy, were used by the techno-barbarian overlords to subjugate the people with brutal application. These short swords and daggers were made for a swift, single thrust, to symbolize how quickly and easily a life can be taken by the wielder. As Terra came under the Emperor's banner, the Custodians adopted this tradition and made it their own. Now, when an aspirant finally earns his Custodian title, he is bestowed a Misericordia as both a symbol of office and a tool of righteous death against any traitors to the Emperor's light, cementing the Custodian's role as the absolution of the Emperor's judgment. In addition to these lethal sidearms and prestigious positions, the arms and armor of the Custodians reflect their special place in the Imperial war machine. Each suit of armor, each weapon, and each vehicle are tailor-made for their user, a specific role, or both. No expense was spared for these guys, and like I mentioned earlier, anything they don't have, they can easily get from other Imperial forces. But the shit they do have is legit. The armor, made of a rare metal aramite, is painstakingly crafted by master artisans whose entire lives are dedicated solely to the construction of it and the rest of their gear, as it is custom fitted for each Custodian. From their armor to arms, it's all handcrafted with only the finest materials and tech available. And on top of looking pretty, their stuff is built to last. A ton of the vehicles they have, for example, we're seeing action back in the days of the Great Crusade, and they're still trucking along. The things the Custodians need to do their jobs must be able to perform without fail, much like their wielders, and the Imperium takes great care to ensure that the Emperor's finest are outfitted with the finest. But using the elegant power weapons and all that of the Custodes is no small feat either. The men and women of the Adeptus Custodes spend their entire lives honing their martial skills, and all their time spent confined to the Imperial Palace hasn't dulled those skills one bit. Each Custodian practices some variation of their organization's fighting styles, known as katas. Each kata has different disciplines within them, but those subsections all follow a general theme. For example, Rendax is all about hunting and swiftly taking down the biggest foes on the battlefield, like siege engines and massive monsters. Victus is more about taking down singular high-value targets. Callistus is about being able to move and strike or shoot while assaulting an enemy. You get the idea. Similarly to the Astartes, the Custodians have a specific structure within their organization, with a Captain General being their supreme ruler, a tribunate which is made up of the most senior 10 Custodes that served as the organization's council, and then the Prefectorate and Shield Captains are under them, their closest equivalent being like the officers and the sergeants of a Space Marines chapter. Outside the command structure, all of the Custodians are roughly the same. Some are specialized for certain roles, as with any organization, but by and large, the Custodes have a meritocracy, where the good deed does not go unnoticed. But the various companies and hosts of the Custodians fall into one chamber or another, so let's take a look at those. The Companions, and no, not the knockoff Fighters Guild from Skyrim, formerly known as the Haterian Guard, is a 300-strong man unit dedicated solely to the protection of the Emperor, the single most important job a Custodian can have. These folks are hand-picked by the Captain General and can be veterans hundreds of years old or new blood who's barely gotten their title. If you prove yourself exceptional, regardless of term of service, you might just have a shot. These Custodians are arranged silently around the Golden Throne, never moving or speaking, only standing watch and ready to leap into battle at a moment's notice. Though such a task sounds easy, it's in fact incredibly draining on those who undertake it, both physically, spiritually, and mentally. And the Captain General will regularly rotate them out in order to allow them to recover from their long vigil of guarding the most powerful being in existence and all the strange toils that come with that. The Companions also protect figures essential to the Imperium's functions, such as those who have a seat on the Council of Terra, like the head of the Navigators, ensuring that all the vital parts of the Imperium are never at risk. The Hyconotoi is the main chamber of the Custodes. Most of them have been or are part of it, and this chamber serves as the bulk of manpower for the organization, providing everything from protection details to executioners to strike teams. When you think of a Custodian, these towering gold demigods wielding a mighty and elegant guardian spear are generally the ones that come to mind. The Tyrannotoi are the heavy shock troopers of the Custodes. They're called in when an enemy force is throwing overwhelming odds against them. They're decked out in custom Terminator armor and pack relics known as Adrathic weapons. These guns date back to the dark age of technology, terrifying disintegration rays that basically unravel the target through their use of unstable and directed energy, making enemy units think twice about launching another assault once they see the immense destruction that these heavily armed and armored ladies and gents can cause. Next, we have the Cataphractoi, the vehicle specialists. These guys are all about speed, recon, lightning attacks. They're piloting the Custodians' many highly advanced tanks, gunships, and jet bikes. The Ephoroi are your Black Ops teams. They specialize in covert operations, counterintelligence and surveillance, and they're also responsible for simulating attack and defense scenarios for their fellow Custodians. When the Custodians wage their war games to practice defending the Imperial Palace, these guys played the opposition, but also served as the instructors to help their fellow Custodes better fulfill their protective duties. The Moratoi is the smallest chamber of the Custodians, and it's comprised of those honored brothers who sustained injuries so severe that they couldn't continue to serve, at least in the traditional sense. As we all know, only in death does duty end, and so those injured are interred into the cybernetic life support sarcophagus of a dreadnought. There's not an exact number, but sources speculate that by the time of the burning of Prospero, there were less than 100 custodian dreadnoughts in service, and that number probably hasn't grown much over the years. Their chassis is the highly advanced Achilles pattern, which, like all their arms and armor, is made to the highest standards that eclipse regular Space Marine dreadnoughts in both power and tech. The Dakonatoi are a small group of Custodes specializing in hunting down traitors corrupted by chaos. They first saw action during the massive cleanup operation known as the Great Scouring shortly after the Horus Heresy, but they are still active today. Finally, we've got the Eyes of the Emperor, made up of custodians who put in their time of traditional service and have retired. Yes, even the immoral super friends of the Emperor eventually face decline. Whether it's from wounds sustained in battle or simply having a reaction time half a second slower than they did before, these custodians have deemed themselves unfit for service because they can no longer provide the best version of themselves. On that day, they turn over all their gear, don hooded black robes, and strike out alone into the stars. Now, this isn't dishonorable. In fact, it's quite the opposite. These retired custodians still serve the Emperor by being his eyes and ears throughout the Imperium. Whenever they come across a situation that could threaten Terra or the Emperor, the Eyes report it directly to the Captain General, who dispatches the appropriate level of force to crush such affronts to the safety of the Emperor and his realm before they have the chance to see the light of day. And that's all I've got for this one, y'all. There is so much depth to custodian lore, and while I knew there was quite a bit, I got blown away the deeper I dove into it all. I might make another video talking about the more specific things later on, so let me know if you want to see something like that. But are you a custodian fan? How do they play on the tabletop? Let me know in the comments, because I don't think I've ever seen a Custodes army in person. As always, drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it, check out the community tab for shitposts and shenanigans. Links to the socials down below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Toodles.